The flight. Natalia had been working as a flight attendant for more years than she could count. At 35, her sharp eye for detail and no-nonsense attitude had made her an asset to the airline. She knew how to navigate the complex world of turbulent passengers, difficult requests, and long hours in cramped spaces. What made her stand out, though, was her ability to maintain her emotional distance from it all. People were just people, some more polite than others, some more demanding, but in the end, it was all just a job. And then there was Micah. The moment he boarded the plane, something about him caught her attention. It wasn't just his disheveled appearance or the way he fumbled with his bag. It wasn't even the uneasy, almost apologetic energy he gave off as he walked down the aisle, awkwardly scanning for his seat. No, there was something else, a nervousness, a vulnerability, that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. It wasn't normal, not for someone on a flight. He wasn't someone who belonged in the sterile, high-altitude world of air travel. He was different. Micah settled into seat 14B, a middle row next to the window. Natalia's eyes briefly followed him as she moved down the aisle, distributing the routine welcome drinks. She had seen all kinds of passengers in her time, but he was an enigma. The other passengers noticed him too, his disheveled clothes, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he placed his bag under the seat. A few of them exchanged uncomfortable glances, whispering under their breath. First-timer, one of the passengers murmured to their neighbor, casting a glance toward Micah. Natalia continued with her duties, offering polite smiles and efficiently serving drinks. She'd been trained to ignore the occasional chatter or muttering, to stay neutral. It wasn't her place to judge. But with Micah, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was an outlier. She tried to dismiss it. After all, she had seen people who looked like they didn't belong on a plane, young, old, dressed in every conceivable way. But the energy around him, the hesitation in his every move, it nagged at her. She reached his row, and as she offered him a drink, he looked up at her. His eyes were wide, nervous, but there was a calmness beneath the surface, a steadiness that didn't fit the rest of him. He spoke up, his voice tentative but polite. "Excuse me, can I get a hot Americano?" Natalia didn't respond immediately. She glanced at him, and for a moment, something flashed through her mind. It was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of judgment. There was something about the way he asked, the way he seemed to believe he could make demands, as if he was entitled to it. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Filthy beggars," she muttered under her breath, her usual detached demeanor cracking for a moment. She didn't mean it, not really. It was just how she felt sometimes after years of serving passengers who had demands beyond their means. She quickly covered it up with a stiff smile. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice cold but polite. She turned away from him, her heels clicking against the floor as she continued with her rounds. The thought of him lingered in her mind as she worked. The way he had asked. The way he had looked at her as if he expected something. She could feel the beginnings of annoyance creeping up her spine. She didn't owe him anything. Why did he think he deserved more than anyone else? When she returned to him a few minutes later, she was still stewing in her thoughts. Instead of a hot Americano, she handed him a cup of cold coffee. The dark liquid sloshed a little as she placed it in front of him. "Here you go," she said, with a sharp smile. "Hope this will do." Micah looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. His hand reached for the cup, and he glanced at her. "I asked for hot," he said, his voice still calm but edged with a quiet frustration. "We're out of hot water," Natalia snapped, not looking him in the eye. She was already turning away, already moving on to the next set of passengers who hadn't dared to challenge her. Her mind was elsewhere, mentally preparing for the next phase of the flight. But then, to her surprise, she heard his voice again. This is cold. And, it tastes awful." Natalia paused for a second, barely registering his words. But when he repeated it, his voice more insistent, she stopped in her tracks. "This coffee is spoiled," he said, holding the cup up, as if showing her the evidence of the mistake she'd made. A flush of irritation rushed through her, but it was quickly replaced with a familiar sneer. She had no intention of letting him get away with criticizing her service. It was a routine, her routine, and she couldn't be bothered to deal with an ungrateful passenger. "Why don't you try being grateful for once?" she said through gritted teeth, her voice sharp, carrying the weight of years spent in the air with passengers who thought they were entitled to everything. "Not every person gets a special drink. You should be thankful we even served you." Micah stood firm, unbothered. He didn't argue, he didn't lash out. Instead, he merely set the cup down in his lap and looked up at her, his expression calm. "I'll be filing a complaint. This isn't acceptable." Natalia felt the anger rise in her chest. It wasn't the first time someone had threatened a complaint, and it wouldn't be the last. She was used to it. But something about Micah made her feel dismissed, in a way. As if she didn't matter to him. He had been too quiet, too composed. The thought irritated her even more. "Go ahead," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "See how far it gets you. See who they believe." Micah didn't say anything more. He simply held the cup up toward her, almost as if challenging her to make a scene. Natalia's hand twitched, and in an instant, she moved. Without thinking, she grabbed the cup from his hand, and before she could stop herself, she tilted it toward him. The cold coffee splashed across his chest and dripped down his clothes, instantly soaking him. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The sound of liquid splattering on fabric echoed in her ears, followed by the laughter of a few passengers. They found it amusing, at least for the moment. Some of them snickered, others whispered behind their hands. Micah, however, didn't react the way she expected. He didn't shout. He didn't even seem angry. Instead, he stood there, soaking wet, his face expressionless. Natalia turned away with a smug look on her face, a sense of satisfaction bubbling up in her chest. She had taught him a lesson, put him in his place. That would be the end of it. But as she walked away, her heart began to race, her stomach twisting. Something about the whole exchange felt off. It wasn't just the look Micah had given her, it was the energy that lingered. It was almost as if she had stirred something that shouldn't have been disturbed. The sound of laughter faded as she made her way to the back of the plane, but the unease grew stronger. Natalia couldn't shake the feeling that her actions had set something into motion, something she didn't understand. Something that would follow her through the rest of this flight. And then, just as she thought the situation couldn't get any worse, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the cabin. Natalia whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was happening, but everything in her told her that this was far from over. What had she unleashed by spilling that coffee on Micah? To her horror, she saw that it wasn't just the passengers who were reacting. It was her own body. She was shaking, trembling, in fact, and her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The mysterious woman. Natalia's body was still tingling with the adrenaline rush of her impulsive actions. She had meant to humiliate Micah with that spilled coffee, to put him in his place, to remind him that in her world, her carefully controlled, predictable world, he didn't belong. She had succeeded, or so she thought. But as she turned back down the aisle, that uneasy sensation she couldn't shake only intensified. It wasn't just the slight tremor in her hands, the queasy feeling in her stomach, it was something else. Something far deeper. She stopped in her tracks when the first scream echoed through the cabin. A shrill, sharp cry that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. At first, she thought it was just one of the passengers reacting to the mess she had caused, perhaps one of the women who had laughed a little too loudly when the coffee splashed across Micah. But when the scream came again, louder and more frantic this time, the unease in Natalia deepened. Her instincts kicked in. She turned toward the source of the noise, her heart pounding in her chest. The passenger closest to her looked equally disturbed, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Did you see that?" the passenger whispered, glancing nervously toward the window next to Micah's seat. There was a trembling quality to the passenger's voice that didn't sit right with Natalia. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. She needed to focus. She couldn't let herself panic. She was a professional. But then it happened. A flash of movement outside the window next to Micah, a blur of pale limbs and wild hair, a face distorted by the thin glass. Natalia froze, her breath catching in her throat. There was someone, or something, clinging to the outside of the plane. No. It couldn't be. The flight was cruising at 35,000 feet, hundreds of miles above the ground. No one could survive out there. It was impossible. She must have been imagining it. But the scream came again, sharper this time, cutting through the air like a knife. "There's a woman," the same passenger cried, pointing frantically toward the window. "She's outside the plane. She's trying to get in." Natalia's stomach churned, and she rushed toward the row. The other passengers began to murmur nervously, their voices a low hum of confusion and disbelief. Some leaned forward in their seats, their faces pressing against the windows as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. But there was nothing. The glass was clear. The sky beyond it was nothing more than the vast expanse of clouds. It looked like any other flight. But still, she felt it. That lingering sensation, the same one she'd had earlier. The one that had told her, deep down, that something wasn't right. Natalia's gaze turned to Micah, who had been quietly observing the chaos unfold. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, their steady, intense focus, told her everything. He knew something. Something she didn't. The woman wasn't just an illusion. The fear in the other passengers' eyes was real, and it was spreading like wildfire. "I saw her too," Natalia said quietly, though it felt like the words didn't belong to her. They felt alien, like a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. There was a woman outside the window. Micah's gaze softened, but there was a glimmer of something else in his eyes, a kind of understanding that sent a chill crawling up Natalia's spine. "It's not just your eyes, Natalia," he said in a low voice, his words almost drowned out by the murmuring of the passengers. "You're seeing her because she's reaching out to you." Natalia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she whispered, taking a hesitant step closer to him. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her uniform as if trying to ground herself in the present, to push away the terrifying thought that was beginning to form in her mind. "The woman," Micah continued, his voice barely audible now, "she's connected to me. But more than that, she's connected to you. You poured that coffee on me for a reason. And now, she's come for you." Natalia's mind raced. What was he saying? How could he know this? She didn't know who he was, where he was from, or why he'd even be talking to her like this. She had done nothing but serve him coffee, a cup that he had, in some inexplicable way, turned into a catalyst for whatever was happening now. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head as she tried to clear her thoughts. "What does it have to do with me?" Micah's eyes softened with sympathy, but there was something darker in them too. "You'll understand soon enough." Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin as the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit, his face drawn tight with concern. "I've checked the exterior of the plane," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "There's nothing out there. No signs of anyone, no anomalies." The passengers were murmuring among themselves, the uncertainty in their voices unmistakable. Natalia felt a strange mixture of relief and dread flood through her. She wanted to believe the co-pilot. It made sense. There was no way anyone could survive outside the plane, much less cling to its window. And yet, the feeling lingered, just beyond the edge of reason. Natalia felt a presence. It was subtle at first, like the pressure of a shadow. But the more she focused on it, the more she felt it pressing in from all directions. It wasn't just her imagination. The co-pilot turned back to the cockpit, his brow furrowed as he muttered to himself. But as he passed by Micah's row, his steps faltered. His eyes widened, a strange expression crossing his face. What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice shaking. Natalia's heart skipped a beat. She glanced back to Micah, who had turned his attention to the window next to him. His face was calm, but his eyes were intense, focused on something that wasn't visible to anyone else. "There's nothing there," the co-pilot said, almost as though trying to convince himself. But the uncertainty was clear in his voice. Natalia, feeling compelled by some force she couldn't explain, approached the window. She stood there for a moment, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on the place where she had first seen the woman. Nothing. Just the sky. Empty. Silent. But as she stared longer, she felt the world shift. Her reflection in the glass seemed to ripple, distort, as if it were no longer hers. Her features blurred, her image fractured. The sound of her heartbeat grew louder in her ears, and her fingers tingled as if they were being drawn into the window. Suddenly, her reflection gave way. She wasn't alone in the glass. A face appeared. A woman's face. Natalia's breath caught in her throat as the woman's eyes locked onto hers. They were wide, filled with desperation, fear, and a raw, painful longing. The woman's mouth moved as if she were speaking, but no sound came. The fear she had been trying to suppress exploded through her chest, and she stumbled back, her knees buckling beneath her. She caught herself just before falling, her heart racing. "Did you see it?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to Micah, her chest heaving as panic began to set in. "Did you see her?" Micah nodded slowly, his expression grim. "Yes, I saw her. I knew she would come. She's real. She's out there." Natalia's voice shook. Micah didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the empty window. Then, in a low, almost reluctant voice, he said, "She's not out there in the way you think. She's here, with us. But she's tied to this plane. To the things that happen here." Natalia didn't know how to process his words. She felt as if her world had been torn open, exposing something dark, something ancient. What had she done? What had she awakened by spilling that coffee? Before she could speak, the woman's face appeared in the glass again, this time clearer than ever. The air around Natalia seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping. She felt as if the very atmosphere were pressing in on her. The woman's mouth moved again, and this time, Natalia thought she heard a faint whisper. "Help me." The words hung in the air like a curse, settling deep into Natalia's bones. The past revealed. The woman's whisper echoed through Natalia's mind like a cold wind, chilling her to the core. She could still see the woman's face clearly now, etched into her vision, those desperate, wide eyes, the pleading expression that seemed to transcend the glass between them. As if somehow, the distance between the woman and her was an illusion. A mere veil that could be torn away with the right force. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, her breaths coming faster. Every instinct in her screamed at her to look away, to turn around and pretend this wasn't happening. But she couldn't. The words, the whisper, kept looping in her mind. "Help me." Micah was still seated, his eyes fixed on the window, his posture unchanged despite the growing tension in the cabin. The other passengers had fallen into a stunned silence, the low murmur of their voices fading into the background as they sensed the gravity of the situation. Natalia could feel the weight of the atmosphere in the cabin, like something heavy pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with every breath. But Micah's silence, his unshaken calmness in the face of the inexplicable, unnerved her more than anything else. She had expected fear, maybe even panic from him, but instead, he sat there as if he had known this moment was coming. "Micah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's going on? What does this have to do with me? What is she? Why is she here?" Micah turned to her slowly, his eyes dark but not unkind. There was something ancient in them, something that spoke of loss, of regret, and of an understanding that stretched far beyond her limited experience. It was as though he had lived a lifetime in the moments they had shared on this flight, and now, he was about to reveal a truth that would alter everything for her. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you've already felt it, haven't you? You're connected to her in a way you don't understand. And the reason she's reaching out to you, reaching out to all of us, is because of what happened all those years ago." Natalia's stomach churned. What happened? She had no memory of anything that could possibly connect her to the woman, let alone to whatever dark history Micah was referring to. Her hands clenched into fists, and she fought to steady her breath. "You have to tell me," she insisted, her voice rising with urgency. "I don't understand." "Why me?" Micah closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering the strength to explain a story too painful to relive. When he spoke again, it was with a quiet intensity, as though each word carried the weight of years of sorrow. "The woman you saw, her name was Maria," he began. "She was my sister. We were raised together in a small town. Our family, our community, we were a part of something larger, something old. You see, Maria wasn't just my sister. She was a part of a legacy that we didn't even fully understand until it was too late." He paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the window, but not at the glass itself. It was as if he was seeing something far beyond it, lost in the depths of his own memories. "She had the gift," he continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The ability to communicate with the dead. To see things no one else could. It wasn't something she could control at first. She was just a child, barely 10 years old, when it started happening. But when it did, it changed everything. People came to her for help, people who had lost loved ones, people who had unfinished business. She was gifted, but also cursed." Natalia's breath hitched. She didn't know what to say, but the pull of the story, the urgency in Micah's voice, was enough to keep her listening. And it wasn't just a gift. It was a curse. As Maria's ability grew stronger, she became a target for darker forces. People who wanted to use her, to exploit her power. Our family couldn't protect her, not from what came for her, not from what followed her. Natalia swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had heard stories of people with strange abilities, stories that belonged more in folklore than in reality. But hearing Micah speak so earnestly, so sincerely, made her realize how deeply he believed in what he was saying. "I didn't know what I was getting involved in," he went on, his eyes still distant. "But my connection to Maria, it was deeper than I realized. When she died, when they took her from us, I didn't understand what it meant. I thought she was gone. But she wasn't. She was always there, just waiting for the right moment to return. And now she's come for you." Micah's gaze finally locked onto hers. "You weren't just an innocent bystander, Natalia. You were there, you were involved. And everything you've done, everything you've felt, it's because of your connection to her." Natalia's head spun as she tried to process what he was saying. She could feel the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud, suffocating her. She was involved? How could that be possible? She had no memory of any of this. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if to banish the thoughts that had begun to form. "I don't remember anything. I don't know what you're talking about. Micah's eyes softened with a mix of sympathy and regret. It wasn't your fault. You weren't aware of it, but it happened. The coffee you poured over me, it wasn't just a random act. It was a trigger. A trigger that bound you to Maria, that brought her back. And now, he trailed off, his voice growing quieter. Now, you can't escape. Natalia's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts spinning like a cyclone. What was he saying? How could something as simple as spilling coffee on him possibly be the catalyst for something so otherworldly? But as her mind tried to process the impossible, her senses sharpened. She felt it again, the pressure in the air, the thickening of the atmosphere. The connection between herself and the woman outside the window, the unseen force that was pressing in on her from all sides. Micah's words had unlocked something deep within her. The fear, the strange sensation that had been gnawing at her ever since she poured that cup of coffee, it wasn't just paranoia. It was real. I didn't want to tell you like this, Micah continued, his voice soft, almost regretful. But there's no other way. Maria's return, it's tied to this plane, to this flight. It's like a bridge between the living and the dead. And it's you, Natalia. You're the key. Her breath caught in her throat. The key to what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The key to everything, Micah said, his voice steady, but the weight of his words was unbearable. Maria's death wasn't just a random tragedy. It was part of something larger, something ancient. And now, because of what you've done, she's come to claim her justice. Natalia's chest tightened, and for the first time since the woman's face had appeared in the glass, she felt the full weight of her actions. The coffee. The arrogance. The mockery. She had thought it was just a small, insignificant incident, something that would be forgotten by the time the flight landed. But now, everything had changed. Micah continued, but his words became more distant, as though he were lost in his own thoughts, searching for a way to make sense of everything. It's not just about her. It's about the forces she left behind, the ones who watched her die. They're coming for all of us, and they won't stop until they've taken what they're owed. Natalia's mind was reeling, but beneath the panic, beneath the fear that clawed at her chest, something else began to emerge, a strange sense of clarity. She had been a part of something she couldn't even remember. And that something was about to consume her whole. Micah turned his gaze back to the window. The woman's face had vanished, but the silence that followed her departure was suffocating. Natalia could feel the pressure of that silence closing in, and deep down, she knew it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The truth unveiled. The plane shuddered again, the unexpected turbulence sending waves of panic through the cabin. The lights flickered once more, and the low hum of the engines was drowned out by the muffled cries and gasps of the passengers. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, uncertain of what was happening, unsure of whether the worst had already passed or if something far worse was yet to come. But through it all, Natalia could only focus on one thing, Micah. His calm demeanor, his eyes distant yet deeply intense, filled her with both dread and a strange sense of certainty. He wasn't panicking. In fact, it seemed as though he had expected this. That only made her more desperate for answers. She needed to understand. She needed to know why she was being dragged into this strange, terrifying web. Micah, sensing the weight of her question without her asking it, finally spoke, his voice almost drowned out by the noises around them. You're beginning to see it, aren't you? Natalia swallowed hard, her throat dry. See what? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting from her to the window again. The storm outside was growing worse, the sky darkening in ways that didn't seem natural. The clouds churned, moving in patterns that defied logic, twisting and spiraling as if they were alive. The woman you saw outside, Micah continued, his voice steady despite the rising chaos, wasn't just an illusion. She was Maria. My sister. But it's not just her you've awakened. It's the entire curse that follows her. Natalia's mind raced as she processed his words. She had thought the figure outside the window was a hallucination, a trick of the light. But now, Micah was telling her something far more sinister, that the woman was real, and that Maria, the woman she had never heard of before today, was tied to something much darker. What curse? She asked, her voice hoarse with disbelief. I don't understand. What are you talking about? Micah turned his head slightly, looking at her as though he were seeing her for the first time. It wasn't pity in his eyes, but a deep understanding, an understanding that came from years of pain, of loss, of knowledge that went beyond the ordinary. The curse is ancient, he explained, his voice soft, but every word was like a weight that pressed harder and harder on Natalia's chest. It's tied to the bloodlines, to the ones who have walked in the shadows, ignored the suffering of others, and thought they could escape it. Natalia's stomach churned. She could feel something deep inside her stirring, like an ancient memory she couldn't quite recall. Her mind resisted, refusing to acknowledge the horrible possibility that Micah's words might be true. She had lived her life without a thought for what went on outside her small bubble, hadn't she? She had served passengers, did her job, kept her distance from others. It wasn't until Micah had boarded that plane, until that moment when she'd poured that cold coffee on him, that anything had ever felt different. I didn't mean to do anything, she whispered, shaking her head. I didn't mean to awaken anything. Micah's expression softened, but his eyes were still heavy with a burden she couldn't even begin to fathom. It's not about what you meant to do, Natalia. The curse was never about intent. It's about the blood that binds us all, and the actions of those who thought they could control it, silence it, ignore it. Maria was the first. She was just a child when she was marked, when she became a target. But you. Your actions, your choices, have brought it all back. You've opened the door. His words hit her like a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet, and for a moment, she was sure she would fall. She gripped the edge of her seat, trying to steady herself, but the vertigo was overwhelming. Open the door? How could she have done that? What was he talking about? The coffee, she said, almost to herself, her voice trembling. That's what it was. The coffee. I didn't think. Of course you didn't think, Micah cut in, his tone more gentle now. You didn't know. None of us knew. But now you do. And you can't pretend it didn't happen. The door has been opened, and whatever was sealed away is coming through. Her breath caught in her throat as she processed what he was saying. What was sealed away? What was coming through? I don't understand, she repeated, though this time, there was no denying the fear creeping into her voice. What does any of this have to do with me? Micah met her gaze, his expression solemn, and then he sighed, as though he were searching for the words to explain something that couldn't fully be explained. You were there. Your family, your bloodline, it's connected to the curse. The choices made, the suffering ignored. You don't remember it, but it's there. It's always been there. Her head swam with confusion, and she shook her head again. She wasn't prepared for this. She had never imagined that something so ancient, so terrible could be tied to her. She had lived her life trying to forget, trying to be above the rest, thinking that nothing would ever truly touch her. But now. What is it that you want from me? She asked, her voice barely audible. What am I supposed to do? How do I stop this? Micah's eyes softened, a shadow of regret crossing his features. I don't know if you can stop it, Natalia. I don't know if any of us can. But you can face it. You can confront the truth. And that's all you can do. He turned to the window again, his gaze distant, as if he could see something far beyond the clouds and the storm that had begun to churn outside. Natalia's eyes followed his, but all she could see was the darkening sky and the twisting, unnatural clouds that seemed to be closing in on them. The storm wasn't just a storm anymore, it was a manifestation of something darker, something ancient, that was unfolding before them. And then, as if the storm itself were reacting to their conversation, the plane lurched again, this time with even greater force. The lights flickered violently, casting long shadows across the cabin. The plane groaned, as if straining against an invisible force, and the sound of metal screeching under pressure reverberated through the cabin. "What's happening?" Natalia gasped, gripping the armrests tightly. The fear had become all-encompassing now, flooding her chest, suffocating her as the plane continued to shake violently. "It's here," Micah said quietly. "The force that follows Maria, the force that has always been connected to the curse, it's here. It's trying to reach you, to bring you into its fold." She wanted to scream. To run. To make sense of it all. But deep down, she knew there was no escaping it. The curse was not some abstract thing, some random force beyond her control. It was part of her, tied to her very essence, like a shadow that followed her every step. The plane jolted again, this time with such force that it felt as though it might break apart. The sound of passengers screaming filled the air, but even in the midst of their terror, there was a certain inevitability in the chaos. The storm outside seemed to be tearing at the fabric of the world itself, dragging the plane deeper into its stormy grip. And then, as if the storm had been waiting for this moment, the whispers returned, louder now, sharper, as though they had multiplied. It was as if the very souls of the dead had come to reclaim what had been taken from them. "Help me," the voice came again, louder, desperate. Natalia's heart raced. The whispers weren't just coming from the air anymore. They were coming from inside the plane. She could feel them in her bones, in her very blood. "Help me. Help me." The voices repeated, over and over, as if they were a part of her, as though the curse had seeped into her very being. She gripped the seat tighter, trying to force herself to breathe, but the voices, the pressure, the storm, it was all too much. And then, in the midst of it all, she realized something. The curse had never just been about Maria. It had always been about the choices made, the lives ignored. It had always been about the price that would eventually be paid. She was part of that price. And now, she had to face it. She had to face the darkness that had followed her for so long. It was time for the truth to be revealed. And nothing could stop it. The awakening. The air in the cabin felt impossibly still, as though the entire plane had been suspended in time. Natalia's mind was in a whirlwind, her thoughts tangled and chaotic, trying desperately to make sense of everything. She could still feel the weight of Micah's words pressing down on her, suffocating her. "You're the key. You've awakened something." Every part of her wanted to scream in denial, to tell herself that none of this could be real. That she hadn't just seen a woman outside the plane, that the whispers in her head weren't real, that Micah wasn't some harbinger of doom, speaking of ancient forces and spirits bound to the living. But deep down, beneath the panic, a seed of truth was starting to sprout, and it was growing fast, expanding in her chest like a cold, suffocating shadow. She had felt it, hadn't she? The moment the coffee spilled, the unsettling sensation that something had shifted. Something had broken free. She glanced at Micah, who remained quiet now, his expression unreadable. The calmness he exuded only made her feel more fragile, more vulnerable. How could he be so composed when everything was falling apart? How could he be so certain of what was happening? And why was she, of all people, at the center of it? The thought of the woman, Maria, clung to her mind, like a haunting memory that wasn't hers. She had never known anyone named Maria, had never felt any connection to the name or the face that had appeared outside the window. But the whisper. The desperate, breathless "help me" that had echoed in her mind, over and over again. "Micah," she said, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "What do you mean by she's come for you?" What am I supposed to do with all of this? Micah's eyes slowly met hers, and for the first time, she saw something that looked like pity, genuine sorrow, tinged with the weight of understanding. You can't run from this, Natalia. You are a part of it. Whether you remember it or not, Maria's death was tied to something far bigger than the two of us. Her ability to reach across the divide, it was a power, and that power has consequences. She never really left. She's always been here. And now, you've unlocked the door. She shook her head. I don't remember any of it. I don't remember anything you're saying. I'm not connected to her. I'm not connected to any of this. This isn't my fault. Micah's gaze softened, but his expression remained serious. I'm not blaming you, Natalia. You didn't know. None of us did. Maria tried to keep it hidden from the world, tried to live a normal life, to escape the weight of it all. But that was the mistake. The forces we're dealing with, they don't let go. Once you're part of the cycle, you can't escape it. Natalia's breath came faster, her heart racing. She wanted to deny it, to reject his words, but deep down, she could feel the tug of truth in them. Something dark was happening, something connected to her, something she couldn't ignore. As the minutes dragged on, the rest of the passengers began to notice the strange tension that had taken root in the cabin. Some had started to whisper again, exchanging fearful glances, while others shifted uneasily in their seats. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence, but it was as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Natalia's eyes flicked to the window again, half expecting to see the woman's face pressed up against the glass, but the space outside remained clear. But it wasn't just the window she was fixated on. It was the feeling in the air, the way the atmosphere felt thicker, heavier, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. The co-pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking the uneasy silence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some minor turbulence at the moment. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated. Minor turbulence? Natalia scoffed inwardly. This wasn't just turbulence. This was something else entirely. But the moment the co-pilot's voice cut off, the plane suddenly lurched, causing several passengers to gasp in surprise. It wasn't the usual shaking from altitude shifts, it was a violent jerk, one that rattled the entire cabin and sent a ripple of panic through the passengers. A few screamed, while others clutched the armrests tightly, their knuckles white. Micah remained calm, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the window as if waiting for something. Natalia's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening, something beyond turbulence, something she couldn't explain. Micah, she snapped, her voice hoarse with fear. What's going on? What is happening to this plane? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed outward. But then, after a long moment, he spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the rising panic in the cabin. She's coming. Natalia's breath caught in her throat. Who is coming? Micah finally turned to her, his expression grave. Maria. The force that follows her, it's reaching us now. The storm, the turbulence, it's just the beginning. We're caught in a power far beyond anything we've ever understood. Before Natalia could respond, another sharp jolt ran through the plane, followed by a deafening roar. The lights flickered, and the entire aircraft seemed to tremble as if it were fighting to stay in the air. The passengers screamed, some shouting for the crew, others praying. The sound of metal creaking under pressure filled the cabin, and a cold, unnatural chill swept through the aisle. The air felt electric, as though charged with an invisible energy that crackled just below the surface. And then, as if on cue, the temperature dropped even further. Natalia's breath came out in visible puffs, and she wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. Her skin prickled with a sensation of being watched from all directions, as though unseen eyes were closing in on her. In the midst of the chaos, Micah remained unfazed, his eyes now locked on the window again. You need to understand, Natalia. This is bigger than both of us. The forces that Maria awakened when she died, they've been gathering, growing stronger. The reason she reached out to you is because you are a part of it now. And whether you're ready or not, you have to confront what's coming. Natalia's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of his words. A part of it? She wasn't part of anything. She was just an ordinary flight attendant, caught in a situation she couldn't understand, surrounded by passengers who had no idea what was truly happening. She had no answers, no control. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear and confusion, there was a strange pull in her chest. A connection she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. The whispers, the cold, distant "help me," they weren't just figments of her imagination. They were real. The lights flickered again, this time staying off for a few seconds longer, plunging the cabin into darkness. The sound of gasps and cries from the passengers echoed through the void, their voices blending together in a chorus of panic. When the lights returned, the temperature hadn't risen. It had only grown colder. The atmosphere had shifted, and the cabin felt as though it were no longer part of the normal world. As if the plane were caught in some kind of limbo, between life and death, between the known and the unknown. And then, from the back of the cabin, the unmistakable sound of whispering reached Natalia's ears. It wasn't coming from the passengers. It was coming from behind her, from the walls, from the air itself. The voices were faint, indistinct at first, but then they became clearer, until she could make out the words. "Help me," the voice whispered again, and this time, it wasn't just a passing thought. It was a command. A plea. Natalia's heart hammered in her chest as she turned toward the sound, her hands shaking. "What is that?" she gasped. Micah's face was ashen now, the reality of the situation setting in. "It's Maria," he said quietly. "She's reaching out, and she's not the only one. We're about to face the consequences of everything that happened that night. The ones who took her, they're coming, too." The whispering grew louder, filling the cabin like a wave crashing over them. The voices were no longer just one. They were many, swirling around them, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. Natalia stumbled back, her mind reeling, but the truth was undeniable now. Maria was here. And so were the forces that had followed her from the grave. They were coming for justice. And they wouldn't stop until they had it. The consequences. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was all that Natalia could hear. It filled her ears like an endless chorus of voices, each one layered on top of the other, a cacophony of desperate pleas, furious wails, and sorrowful cries. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, the temperature plummeting further as if the very atmosphere itself was suffocating under the weight of something unseen, something far more ancient than any of them could comprehend. Natalia's heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the armrest of her seat, her knuckles turning white. The cold was unbearable now, a biting frost that seemed to sink into her bones. She could feel it, the pressure of it, the sense that something was closing in on them, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The passengers around her were in full panic mode, their screams filling the air, their eyes wide with terror. Some were praying, others were huddling together, trying to make sense of the madness that had overtaken the flight. But no one was making sense of it. No one could. "What's happening?" one of the passengers shouted, her voice high with panic. "Why is it so cold? What is that sound?" Micah didn't respond immediately. He remained eerily calm, his eyes fixed on the window once again, staring into the swirling storm outside. The very air around him seemed to hum with a strange energy, and Natalia could feel it too, like an electric charge running through the cabin, making her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. "They're coming," Micah finally spoke, his voice steady but full of dread. "The ones who took Maria, they've been waiting for this moment. And now they've come to claim what's theirs." Natalia's chest tightened as the realization hit her like a slap in the face. She had been a part of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. She hadn't just spilled coffee on an innocent man. She had awakened something that had been dormant for years, something that was now reaching out to claim her, to claim all of them. She could feel it now, like an invisible force closing in on them, pressing against the walls of the plane, squeezing the life out of the cabin. The whispering voices grew louder still, now distinct in their tones, some angry, some pleading, others filled with grief. "Help me," one voice whispered, close to her ear. Natalia's heart skipped a beat, but when she turned, there was no one there. She felt as though the voices were inside her head, inside her very soul, clawing their way through the cracks that had begun to form in her mind. What did they want? She wondered frantically. Why were they after her? Micah seemed to sense her thoughts, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's not just about Maria," he said softly. "She was only the beginning. There's a dark force that's been tied to this plane for generations, a curse that has passed down through the bloodlines. Your actions, the way you've treated people, the way you've ignored the suffering of others, this is what has drawn them in." Natalia's breath caught in her throat. She could hardly breathe, could hardly think. The weight of Micah's words crushed her, suffocating her with their truth. Her entire life, all the small moments of cruelty, of dismissing others, of pretending that she was above it all, they had led her to this moment. They had opened the door to something far darker than she could have ever imagined. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never knew any of this. I never meant to hurt anyone. I didn't even know who she was." Micah's gaze softened, but there was a sadness in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. "You didn't know, but that doesn't matter anymore. The curse doesn't care about intent. It's about the choices you've made, the people you've hurt, the things you've ignored. Maria was just the first to reach out, but the others, the ones who died because of it, they are coming, too." Natalia shook her head, the weight of the truth settling heavily on her shoulders. She felt the walls of the plane closing in on her, the pressure in the cabin growing unbearable. She didn't know how to stop it. She didn't know how to undo what she had awakened. All she could do was stand there, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for the consequences to unfold. And then, as if in response to her growing dread, the lights in the cabin flickered again, casting the passengers' faces in eerie shadows. The plane lurched again, this time more violently than before, throwing passengers from their seats and sending bags flying through the air. Natalia gasped as the plane twisted and turned, the sound of metal groaning under pressure filling the cabin. It felt as though the very structure of the plane was fighting against something, as though it were caught in a battle between two worlds, the world of the living and something far darker. The whispering reached a fever pitch, its volume almost deafening now. The voices swirled around her, overlapping and intertwining, until they were nothing more than a blur of sound. And in the center of it all, there was Maria's voice, clearer than ever. "Help me." It was a scream now, a cry of desperation that sent a jolt of fear through Natalia's entire body. The whispers were becoming more distinct, more focused, until she could hear the names of the dead being spoken in the air around her, people whose lives had been claimed by the curse, people who had suffered because of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The plane stilled. The whispers faded into silence. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the lights flickered back on. The passengers, who had been on the edge of hysteria just moments ago, were now completely still, staring ahead in disbelief, as if the world had changed in a single instant. Natalia's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart racing in her chest as she looked around. Had it ended? Was it over? She glanced toward Micah, but his face was unreadable, his eyes distant. It was as though he had already accepted the inevitable, as though he knew this was just the beginning. "The storm has passed for now," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "But it will come again. The consequences are already set in motion, and nothing can stop it now. Not until justice has been served. Natalia's mind reeled, struggling to comprehend what he had said. What did he mean by justice? What did they want from her? She had tried to ignore the truth, to push it away, but now it was clear. The forces that had been unleashed were not just after her, they were after everyone on this plane. "What do I do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How do I stop it?" Micah's eyes softened with a look of sorrow. "You can't stop it. None of us can. But you can make a choice. You can choose to face what's coming, to confront the darkness that has been awakened. You can choose to right the wrongs that were done. Or you can let it consume you." Natalia's mind was a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and guilt. How could she possibly face something so ancient, so powerful? How could she undo the damage that had already been done? But in the pit of her stomach, she knew that there was no escaping it. The curse that had been set into motion could not be undone. The consequences of her actions, of all the pain she had caused throughout her life, were coming for her, coming for all of them. And there was only one way to end it. She had to face it. She had to confront the darkness that had been awakened, or it would consume her. And as the plane flew on, as the cold still lingered in the air and the whispers of the dead faded into silence, Natalia knew that the true test had only just begun. The forces of the past were coming, and there was no turning back. The only question now was whether she had the strength to face them. "You said